In the English countryside stands a palace that stretches longer than Buckingham Palace. 365 rooms, one for each day of the year. 5 miles of corridors. Facades of honey-colored stone that catch the afternoon sun. This is Wentworth Woodhouse, once the grandest private house in Britain. This is also the story of how a monument to permanence became a burden too expensive for anyone to bear. For 2 centuries, it was the seat of aristocratic power, built to proclaim that wealth and lineage would endure forever. Within its walls, thousands of servants labored in a parallel world most guests never saw. But permanence, it turned out, was more fragile than stone. The house survived wars, revolutions, and the collapse of the system that created it. Yet survival came at a price, measured not in pounds alone, but in broken lives, erased names, and questions England still struggles to answer. How does a dream of empire become a ruin? The answer begins with one family's ambition and an architect's impossible vision. In 1720, Thomas Watson Wentworth inherited a problem disguised as a privilege. He became the wealthiest commoner in England. Coal seams ran beneath his Yorkshire estates, black wealth that poured money into his accounts at a rate that embarrassed even established aristocrats. Yet wealth alone could not buy what he needed most. The Wentworth family had held land in Yorkshire since medieval times. They had survived civil wars, religious upheavals, and the dangerous game of royal favor. By the early 18th century, they stood among England's richest families. But rich was not the same as secure. The aristocracy operated by rules older than memory, rules about bloodlines and titles, and the subtle hierarchies that determined who mattered and who merely had money. Thomas understood this distinction with painful clarity. His fortune came from coal, from the labor of miners, who descended into darkness each morning, from industrial wealth that the old families, the Howards, and Cavendishes and Russells, whose money came from land grants bestowed by long-dead kings, viewed with polite disdain. New money always carried a stain, no matter how many zeros followed the first digit. The wound deepened when Thomas received his title. In 1714, he became Baron Malton. In 1720, he was elevated to Earl of Malton. These were honors, certainly, but they were also reminders of what he lacked. Other families held dukedoms stretching back centuries. Their seats in the House of Lords were inherited, automatic, unquestioned. Thomas bought his way in through political loyalty and strategic marriage, and everyone knew it. Then came the trigger. In 1728, a distant branch of the Wentworth family, the Earls of Strafford, began building their own grand house at Wentworth Castle, just 4 miles away. The rivalry was bitter, rooted in inheritance disputes and competing claims to the family name. The Strafford Wentworths were building large. They were building in the Baroque style, all drama and continental grandeur, designed to proclaim their importance to anyone who passed. Thomas could not let this stand. If the Strafford branch built large, he would build larger. If they sought to dominate the landscape, he would create something that made their house look modest. This was not simply vanity. In aristocratic England, architecture was argument. The house you built declared your position, your wealth, your right to power. To be outdone was to be diminished, perhaps permanently. His solution was characteristically ambitious. He would tear down the existing Jacobean house and build something unprecedented, not merely grand, but overwhelming, a house that would establish beyond doubt which branch of the Wentworth family truly mattered. He hired architects with the best credentials, first Thomas Archer, then later Henry Flitcroft, both men versed in the Palladian style that dominated English taste. Palladian architecture spoke of classical learning, of proportion and restraint, of ancient Rome and modern sophistication. It was the architectural language of the ruling class, and Thomas intended to speak it more fluently than anyone else. The plans were extraordinary. The house would have 2 facades, east and west, both stretching longer than anything England had yet seen. The east front would measure 600 feet. 600. Most country houses considered themselves large at 150. Thomas was planning to build 4 times that length. 365 rooms, one for every day of the year, a detail he specified with deliberate symbolism. The scale made a statement. This was not a house that could be ignored. This was not architecture that whispered. This was a palace that would be visible from miles across the Yorkshire countryside, that would employ hundreds, that would host royalty and prime ministers, that would force every other aristocrat to look up and acknowledge the Wentworth wealth and power. Estimates for the cost varied, but all agreed it would be staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest the building would require at least £100,000, a sum equivalent to perhaps £150 million today. Some historians place the figure higher, arguing that the final cost, with furnishings and grounds, exceeded £200,000. Either way, the number represented wealth on a scale most families could not comprehend, let alone command. Thomas had the money. Cole made certain of that. Revenue from the mines and from agricultural rents across his thousands of acres meant he could afford what others only dreamed of. Money bought him the land for expansion. Money bought him the architects, the craftsmen, the materials. Money would buy him a house that towered over every rival. But money could not buy him acceptance from the oldest families. Money could not erase the taint of coal and industry. Money could not make his title ancient or his bloodline unquestionably blue. The house would have to do that work. The house would have to be so magnificent, so undeniable, that it forced respect from those who might otherwise look down on the Wentworth fortune as merely new, merely commercial, merely coal. This was the equation that drove the project. Build something permanent. Build something that would stand for centuries, long enough for the stain of new money to fade, long enough for future generations to forget that the fortune came from mines rather than royal grants. Build something that could never be dismissed or ignored. Build something that made rivals, even those with older titles and purer bloodlines, seem small by comparison. The decision to proceed was made in 1725. Construction would begin shortly after. But first came the preparations, the clearing of land, the surveying, the negotiations with quarries and timber suppliers. Every detail had to be perfect. Every element had to reinforce the message Thomas needed the house to send. He was creating a throne. Not literally, though the house would contain ceremonial spaces grand enough for kings. He was creating a physical manifestation of power that could not be taken away by political winds or the whims of monarchs. Titles could be stripped. Fortunes could be lost. But a house built on this scale, in stone and marble, with foundations deep enough to last centuries, that was permanence made visible. Thomas Watson Wentworth believed, with a faith that seems almost touching in its innocence, that what he built in Yorkshire would last forever, that his descendants would walk these halls long after everyone alive in 1725 had turned to dust, that the house would become synonymous with the Wentworth name, that it would erase any questions about their position, that it would finally and completely answer the wound that drove him to build in the first place. The work began in earnest by 1725. It would take decades to complete. What rose from the Yorkshire earth was, by any measure, extraordinary. But to understand its true cost, you had to look beyond the architect's drawings and the aristocratic dreams. You had to see what lay beneath the grandeur, what labor would be required, and whose names would be forgotten in the building of a monument meant to last forever. Between 1725 and 1750, Wentworth Woodhouse rose slowly from the Yorkshire earth. The work took a quarter of a century. This was not simply building a house. It was importing an entire vision of aristocratic permanence, piece by piece, stone by stone, through the labor of hundreds of men whose names would vanish from every record except the payroll ledgers that no one kept. The scale demanded workforce numbers that strained the local population. At the construction's peak, estimates suggest more than 500 men worked on site. Some were local, Yorkshire laborers, who walked to the site each morning from villages across the estate. Others came from farther away, skilled craftsmen from London and the South, drawn by wages that were good by the standards of the time, but modest compared to the fortune being spent around them. The stone came from local quarries. Sandstone, the honey-colored rock that gave Yorkshire architecture its distinctive warmth. Quarrying was brutal work. Men worked with hand tools, chisels, and hammers, splitting stone from the earth in blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds. The dust hung in the air, coating lungs, settling in throats. Respiratory ailments among quarry workers were common enough that they barely warranted mention in estate records. The stone was needed, the men cut it. That was the transaction. Transportation posed its own challenges. Each block of stone had to be moved from quarry to construction site, a distance of several miles in some cases. Wagons pulled by teams of horses carried the loads. The roads, barely adequate for normal traffic, deteriorated under the weight. Repairs were constant, accidents were frequent. A wagon wheel breaking under load, a horse stumbling, stone blocks shifting and crushing whoever stood too close. The estate records that survive mention compensation paid to widows, small sums that acknowledged loss without dwelling on it. At the building site itself, the work proceeded in phases. First came the foundations. Massive excavations dug by hand. Men with shovels moved tons of earth, creating trenches deep enough to support walls that would rise 4 stories high. The foundation work alone took years. Engineers worried about the weight, about the expansive clay soil beneath the surface, about water drainage across the low-lying site. Solutions required ingenuity and always more labor. The walls rose slowly. Stonemasons, men who had trained for years in their craft, worked in teams. Each block had to be cut precisely, fitted tightly against its neighbors, secured with mortar mixed fresh each day. The work demanded skill, but it also demanded endurance. 12-hour days were standard, longer in summer when daylight allowed, shorter in winter when frost made mortar useless and fingers too numb to grip tools properly. Scaffolding covered the facades as they climbed higher. Wooden structures, lashed together with rope, swaying slightly in the wind. Men worked at heights that would make modern safety officers recoil. Falls happened. Estate records acknowledge several deaths from falls during the construction years, though the exact number remains uncertain. Workers who survived injuries often faced permanent disability with no compensation beyond immediate medical costs, such as they were. The interior presented different challenges. Flitcroft's designs called for elaborate plasterwork, carved wooden details, marble floors, painted ceilings. Italian craftsmen were brought in for the most delicate work. Plasterers, whose skills could create the intricate moldings and ceiling decorations that marked a house as truly grand. These men were better paid than the local laborers, their expertise recognized and compensated. Yet they too worked long hours in difficult conditions, balanced on scaffolding, breathing dust, their hands cramped from the precision work. Marble came from quarries in Derbyshire and from Italy. Importing Italian marble required shipping it across the Mediterranean, through the Channel, up the east coast to Hull, then overland to Yorkshire. The logistics were complex. The costs were enormous. A single marble fireplace surround could cost what a laborer might earn in 5 years. The house would eventually contain dozens. Timber came from estate forests and from Norway. English oak for the main structural beams, Norwegian pine for lesser elements. The carpentry work employed dozens of men. Master carpenters directed teams who shaped beams, fitted joints, constructed the roof structures that would span those extraordinary facades. The east front, 600 feet long, required roof trusses engineered to carry weight across distances that tested contemporary understanding of structural mechanics. Lead for the roof came from mines in the Pennines. The installation was dangerous work. Lead is heavy, toxic, difficult to work with. Men who handled lead sheeting developed distinctive ailments, hand tremors, and stomach problems that worsened over years. The house required tons of it. The health costs to the men who installed it went unrecorded. Windows posed particular challenges. Glass in the 1,730 seconds was expensive and difficult to produce at the scale and quality Wentworth Woodhouse demanded. Each of the hundreds of windows required multiple panes, each pane individually blown and fitted. Glaziers worked carefully, knowing that a single mistake meant wasted materials and lost time. The costs mounted. Contemporaries estimated that the windows alone cost several £1,000s, enough to build an entire substantial house for a merchant family. While the main house claimed attention and admiration, A parallel structure rose alongside it, largely invisible to visitors but essential to the building's purpose. The service wing stretched north from the main block, a complex of kitchens, pantries, sculleries, laundries, brewhouses, storage rooms, and servant quarters. This was where the real machinery of aristocratic life would be housed, where the labor that made elegance possible would be performed, day after day, year after year. The kitchens were vast, multiple cooking ranges, each requiring constant feeding with coal, preparation tables stretching the length of the room, storage areas for provisions, cool rooms for meat and dairy, secure pantries for expensive spices and imported ingredients. The heat in summer was brutal. The smoke and steam hung heavy even with high ceilings and ventilation chimneys. This was where kitchen staff would spend their working lives, preparing meals for the family and their endless stream of guests. The laundries were industrial operations. Tubs for washing, mangles for pressing, drying rooms, heated by fires that burned through mountains of coal. The work was women's work, paid less than men's labor, physically exhausting, hands perpetually raw from lye soap and hot water. The volume of linens a house this size generated was staggering. Table linens, bed linens, personal linens, all requiring washing, pressing, and careful storage. Servant quarters were built to house the army required to run the estate. The hierarchy was strict. Upper servants like the butler and housekeeper received private rooms, small but individual. Lower servants shared dormitory-style accommodations, beds in rooms that housed 6 or 8 people, privacy non-existent. Male and female quarters were strictly separated. Rules governed every aspect of servant life, from waking times to evening curfews, from acceptable conversation to forbidden relationships. The design of separation was meticulous. Service staircases, narrow and steep, allowed servants to move between floors without using the main stairs where family and guests walked. Service corridors ran parallel to main hallways, hidden behind paneling, or tucked into spaces between rooms. Servants could move through the house like ghosts, always present when needed, invisible when not. The basement level housed mechanical systems, storage for coal to heat the house, later for the gas system that would provide lighting, workshops for carpenters and other maintenance staff, wine cellars carved deep into the earth, naturally cool, secure. This underworld kept the visible house functioning, a city beneath a palace, populated by workers whose labor was essential but acknowledgement rare. By 1750, the East Front was largely complete. The West Front would take another decade. The total cost remains uncertain. Estate records from the period are incomplete. Most historians estimate the construction consumed at least £200,000, possibly significantly more. In today's terms, that represents perhaps £250 million or more. The fortune Thomas Watson Wentworth had inherited from coal had been poured into stone, marble, and craftsmanship. The first family occupancy came in the early 1752s. Thomas himself died in 1750, never seeing his vision fully realized. His son, also Thomas, inherited both the title and the incomplete palace. The younger Thomas continued the work, driven by the same ambition that had motivated his father, determined to complete what had been started. The opening season must have been spectacular, guests arriving to find a house that dwarfed anything they had seen before. Rooms opening one after another, each more elaborate than the last. Ceilings painted with classical scenes. Fireplaces carved from single blocks of marble. Floors polished to mirror brightness. Everything designed to overwhelm, to impress, to establish beyond doubt that the Wentworth family had arrived at the pinnacle of English society. Yet beneath the spectacle, invisible to guests, exhaustion. The workers who had built the house were gone, scattered back to their villages, or moved on to other projects. The craftsmen who had created the elaborate details had taken their wages and left. What remained were the servants, the permanent staff who would keep the fantasy running. They moved into their quarters, learned their roles, began the routines that would define their lives for decades to come. The house was complete. The family moved in. Now, the real work began. Life at Wentworth Woodhouse followed rhythms as precise as clockwork. Each morning at 5:30, the house began to wake. Not the family, the servants. The lowest housemaids rose first, dressing quickly in the cold dormitory rooms where 6 or 8 women shared space barely adequate for 3. Their first task was to descend through the service stairs to the main floors, moving silently through rooms where the family and any overnight guests still slept. They cleaned and laid fires in grates throughout the house, 30 or 40 fireplaces that needed ash removed, coal carried, kindling arranged, flames coaxed to life before anyone upstairs stirred. The work was filthy. Coal, dust coated hands and uniforms. Knees ached from kneeling on stone floors. The maids had perhaps 20 minutes per fireplace. Any longer, and the schedule collapsed. By 6, the kitchen staff assembled. The head cook commanded a team of 8 to 12 people during normal operations, more when the house entertained. Breakfast preparation began. For the family, a spread of choices: eggs, bacon, kippers, toast, preserves, fresh bread, tea, coffee. For the upper servants, a simpler but substantial meal taken in the servants' hall. For the lower servants, porridge and bread, eaten quickly before the real work of the day accelerated. The kitchen itself was a factory. Cast iron ranges, burning constantly. Heat that made summer work nearly unbearable. Preparation tables where vegetables arrived from the estate gardens and were transformed into components of elaborate meals. A scullery where the lowest kitchen maids scrubbed pots and dishes in water heated over fires, their hands perpetually red and cracked. Pantries and larders storing provisions, meat safes keeping flies away from hanging game, ice delivered weekly in blocks to preserve dairy and fish. The hierarchy was rigid and everyone knew their place. At the top stood the butler and housekeeper, senior servants with authority over all others. The butler managed male servants, oversaw the wine cellars, served at table, and maintained standards in the public rooms. The housekeeper controlled female servants, managed linens and household supplies, and kept the keys to storerooms where valuable items were locked away. Both received annual salaries of approximately 50 to 80 pounds, substantial by servant standards, though modest compared to the family's annual income from the estates, which ran into the tens of thousands. Below them came the upper servants. The valet who attended the master personally, the lady's maid who dressed the mistress and maintained her wardrobe, the head cook. These positions commanded respect and relative comfort, private rooms and meals that approximated what the family ate rather than the servants' fare. Then the middle ranks. Footmen who wore livery and served at table, answered doors, and provided visible elegance whenever guests appeared. Housemaids responsible for cleaning specific rooms or floors. Kitchen maids who prepared vegetables and assisted the cook. Each role had its duties, its place in the daily choreography, its unwritten rules about who spoke to whom and when. At the bottom, the scullery, maids, hallboys, and outdoor laborers, whose work was hardest and whose pay was lowest. A scullery maid might earn 8 to 12 pounds per year plus room and board. Her day began before dawn and ended after the last pot was scrubbed, often 16 hours of labor with few breaks. Promotion was possible, but slow, each step up the hierarchy, taking years and depending on positions becoming vacant through retirement, marriage, or dismissal. The laundry operations consumed the labor of multiple women full-time. The volume of linens in a house this size was extraordinary. Bed sheets for dozens of bedrooms changed multiple times per week. Table linens for the dining room, replaced after every meal. Personal linens for the family and guests. Servants' uniforms and household cloths. The washing alone required enormous effort. Boiling water in copper tubs, scrubbing with harsh soap, wringing by hand or through mangles, hanging to dry in the drying rooms or outdoors in good weather. Then came the ironing, heating flat irons on stoves, pressing each piece carefully. The women who did this work developed distinctive ailments, shoulders and backs damaged from the physical strain, hands perpetually rough despite attempts at protection, respiratory problems from the constant steam and chemical fumes. Maintenance never stopped. The house was so vast that by the time cleaners finished one end, the other end needed attention again. Windows required washing, hundreds of individual panes. Floors demanded daily sweeping and weekly polishing. Wooden paneling needed dusting and occasional treatment with oils to prevent drying. Carpets were beaten to remove dust, a task that required multiple strong workers and generated clouds of choking particles. Brass fixtures required regular polishing. Silver needed constant attention to prevent tarnish. Outside, the grounds demanded their own workforce. Gardeners maintained formal gardens, vegetables gardens that supplied the kitchens, greenhouses producing exotic plants and out-of-season produce. The estate employed approximately a dozen full-time gardeners, plus additional seasonal labor during planting and harvest. Gamekeepers managed the shooting estate, breeding pheasants and managing woodland to ensure good sport for the family and their guests. Stable staff cared for dozens of horses, mucking stalls, feeding, grooming, maintaining tack and carriages. Estate carpenters, masons, and general laborers handled repairs to buildings, fences, roads, and bridges across thousands of acres. The total staff varied by season, but typically numbered between 70 and 100 people living on the estate, with additional day laborers hired for specific tasks. The annual cost of maintaining this workforce, including wages, accommodation, and provisions, reportedly approached several £1,000s, a figure that represented perhaps 10 to 15% of the estate's annual income. The rules of invisibility were absolute. Servants used designated staircases, narrow and steep, often unlit. They moved through service corridors hidden behind walls, accessible through disguised doors that blended into paneling. When carrying supplies or cleaning materials through the main house, they timed their movements for moments when the family was unlikely to appear. If a servant encountered a family member unexpectedly, the servant would turn to face the wall, effectively becoming invisible, waiting for the superior to pass. Eye contact was forbidden. Conversation unsolicited by a family member was unthinkable. While servants labored below and behind, life upstairs proceeded with studied ease. The family rose late, breakfast served in their rooms or in the breakfast room at their leisure. Morning activities might include correspondence, reading, rides across the estate, or visits to tenants. Lunch was informal by the standards of the house, but still required multiple courses and attendant staff. Afternoons brought social calls, country pursuits like shooting or fishing, or simply leisure. The rhythm was unhurried, deliberately so, projecting an image of lives untroubled by necessity or labor. Entertaining was constant during the season. Country house weekends brought dozens of guests for shooting parties in autumn and winter. Political allies of the family, themselves, lords and MPs, came for consultations that might shape national policy. The house became an informal seat of power, where decisions were made over port and cigars after elaborate dinners. Social gatherings mixed aristocracy with wealthy industrialists, marriages arranged or business deals negotiated in drawing rooms, while servants moved invisibly, serving, observing, never acknowledged. The dinner parties showcased the house and the invisible machinery that sustained it. Guests arrived to find fires blazing in every room despite the November cold outside. They dressed for dinner in rooms where hot water had been delivered, towels laid out, evening clothes pressed and ready. They descended to dining rooms, where the table gleamed with silver, crystal, and porcelain. 7 courses arrived in perfect sequence, each dish precisely timed, wine matched appropriately, service executed with choreographed precision. The conversation flowed across topics deemed suitable, politics and sport and society gossip, never touching on anything that might disturb the carefully maintained atmosphere of elevated civilization. What the guests rarely considered was the machinery beneath. While they dined upstairs, the kitchen below operated at crisis level. Multiple dishes cooking simultaneously, timing coordinated to the minute, the heat brutal, the pressure relentless. Footmen carried heavy trays up service stairs, maintaining perfect posture and neutral expressions despite the physical strain. Between courses, they descended to collect the next round, while scullery maids washed dishes from the previous course, working frantically to have plates ready for the next. One delayed dish, one dropped tray, one moment of visible effort from a servant could mar the illusion of effortless luxury that was the whole point of the exercise. The cost of maintaining appearances was high. Financially, the estate poured thousands of pounds annually into wages, provisions, coal for heating, candles, and later gas for lighting, repairs, and the endless small expenses that accumulated. Physically, the cost was measured in broken bodies. Servants whose health failed from years of hard labor, who aged prematurely, who developed injuries or illnesses directly traceable to their work, but who received no compensation beyond immediate dismissal when they could no longer perform their duties. Socially, the cost was a rigidly enforced hierarchy that determined every aspect of existence from birth. A child born in the servants' quarters would almost certainly die in service. A family that had provided footmen and maids for generations would provide footmen and maids to the next generation. Education beyond basic literacy was rare. Advancement beyond the servant class was nearly impossible. The system was designed to be permanent, natural, inevitable as the seasons. The Wentworth family accepted this arrangement without apparent question. The estate records that survive show concern for efficiency and economy, but little recognition of servants as individual humans with interior lives. They were fixtures, parts of the house, like the furniture or the elaborate plasterwork. Necessary, maintained when functional, replaced when broken. Yet servants were human. They formed relationships, friendships, and sometimes romances despite rules forbidding them. They had ambitions and disappointments. They watched the family's extravagance and drew their own conclusions, rarely recorded but occasionally surfacing in memoirs written decades later. They understood, perhaps better than the family themselves, exactly how much labor went into creating the appearance of effortless aristocratic superiority. The system seemed eternal. The rhythm of seasons, the hierarchy of service, the certainty of class position, all appeared permanent, woven into the fabric of English society as securely as the stone that built the house. Then came August 1914. When war came in August 1914, it arrived as a disruption to routines that had seemed as permanent as the stone walls themselves. The declaration against Germany triggered responses that crossed class boundaries, at least at first. Duty called. Patriotism surged. Young men from both the great house and the servants' quarters prepared to enlist. The 7th, Earl Fitzwilliam, William Wentworth Fitzwilliam, had inherited the title and estates in 1902. By 1914, he was in his 40s, too old for active service. His sons were not. The eldest, Viscount Milton, was 22. Military service was expected of aristocratic men, not merely duty, but a demonstration of class responsibility. He enlisted almost immediately, commissioned as an officer in the Yorkshire Regiment by virtue of his birth and education rather than military training. Other young men from the family and their social circle followed the same path. Officers' commissions granted automatically to those whose names and connections marked them as natural leaders. The servants who enlisted faced different circumstances. Footmen, grooms, gardeners, younger men whose labor had kept the estate running, joined local regiments as ordinary soldiers. They went not as officers, but as privates, cannon fodder by a system that determined military rank by peacetime social status. The estate records suggest at least 30 to 40 men from the household and surrounding tenant farms enlisted in the first months of the war. Their names appeared on lists, sometimes. Their ranks were noted. Their fates would mostly go unrecorded except in aggregate casualty figures. The house itself transformed rapidly. The War Office requisitioned country houses across England for military purposes. Wentworth Woodhouse became an auxiliary hospital, its ballrooms and drawing rooms cleared of furniture, converted into wards for wounded soldiers shipped back from France. Medical equipment arrived. Army nurses took up residence. The great house that had been built to proclaim aristocratic permanence now served a purpose its creators never imagined. Lady Fitzwilliam and other aristocratic women organized themselves as volunteer nurses. Though their duties were carefully limited, They provided comfort, wrote letters for wounded men, supervised supplies. The actual medical work, the cleaning of wounds, the emptying of bedpans, the handling of men screaming from pain or infection, that fell to trained nurses and to servants who found themselves pressed into medical service with minimal training. The class boundaries held even in crisis. The conversion created strange juxtapositions. Men who would never have been permitted past the servants' entrance in peacetime now lay in beds set up in the marble hall. Working-class soldiers, miners and factory workers in uniform, occupied spaces designed for aristocratic leisure. The wounded came from Yorkshire regiments and from other units, men from across England's industrial cities and rural counties, temporarily inhabiting a world that had been built explicitly to exclude them. The experience left impressions on both sides. Soldiers wrote home about the palace where they recovered. The family observed the reality of war's human cost more directly than they might have otherwise. Yet even as hospital, the house required constant labor. The staff who remained, mostly women now with so many men gone, worked longer hours under harder conditions. Laundries that had handled household linens now processed blood-stained bandages and surgical cloths. Kitchens that had prepared elaborate dinners now cooked institutional meals for dozens of patients. The supply chains that had brought luxury goods broke down as the war economy diverted resources toward military needs. Rationing reached even Wentworth Woodhouse. Sugar, butter, meat, all suddenly limited. The estate's own farms helped, but production declined as tenant farmers lost workers to the army and faced pressure to shift from profitable crops to staple grains demanded by government order. The black market functioned, certainly, and families with sufficient money could supplement rations, but the reality of genuine scarcity became impossible to ignore. The financial pressures mounted more slowly but more seriously than food shortages. The estate's income derived from agricultural rents and from coal mining royalties on seams beneath the property. Agricultural income declined as tenant farmers struggled with labor shortages and government price controls. Mining income held steadier initially, coal being essential for the war effort. But increased taxation began to bite. In 1914, the highest income tax rate was 8%. By 1918, it had risen to 30% for the wealthiest taxpayers. Death duties, inheritance taxes triggered when a title passed from one generation to the next, increased from a maximum of 15% to 40%. The aristocracy had always contributed to government finances, but the war accelerated a shift from modest taxation toward systematic extraction of wealth from landed estates. The implications would take years to fully manifest, but the direction was clear. Death came to the family in 1915. Viscount Milton died of wounds received in France. The heir to one of England's greatest fortunes, killed at 23. His younger brother survived the war but died from complications of wounds in 1920. The family's direct male line, the succession that was supposed to carry the name and title forward indefinitely, was broken. The title eventually passed to distant cousins, but the emotional blow landed hard. Permanence, it turned out, was no protection against artillery shells and machine gun fire. The servant men who died received less attention but died in greater numbers. Estate records suggest that of the roughly 40 men who enlisted from the household and immediate tenant farms, at least 12 were killed and several more returned with injuries that prevented them from resuming their previous work. Their names appeared in local memorial lists. Sometimes, their families received official condolence letters, standard forms with names filled in. Compensation was minimal. Widows and children faced futures without breadwinners, often without adequate support. The contrast with the mourning for aristocratic dead was stark. Both were grieved, certainly, but not equally, not publicly, not with the same resources devoted to commemoration. The men who returned came back changed. Some bore physical injuries, lost limbs, damaged lungs from gas attacks, wounds that healed badly or not at all. Others carried psychological damage that the era barely acknowledged and certainly did not know how to treat. Shell shock was seen as weakness, cowardice, something to be overcome through willpower rather than medical treatment. Men struggled to resume lives, disrupted by what they had experienced. trying to fit back into civilian routines that felt alien after the trenches. The house itself showed wear. Parts of the building had been heavily used, floors damaged, walls marked, systems strained by institutional demands they were never designed to meet. Maintenance had been deferred, skilled workers unavailable, materials diverted to war production. Salt from Yorkshire's damp climate had 4 years to work on stone and metal without the constant attention that had previously held decay at bay. The house was still magnificent, but close inspection revealed cracks, both literal and metaphorical. When the armistice came in November 1918, the initial reaction was relief. The nightmare had ended. But relief gave way quickly to harder questions. What now? The hospital closed. The wounded moved to other facilities or were discharged. The house needed to return to its peacetime purpose, but that purpose seemed less certain than it had in 1914. The staff was diminished. Men who might have returned to footmen or groom positions had died or found other work. Women who had taken on new responsibilities during the war were not eager to return to scullery maid status without protest. Wages had risen during the war years due to labor scarcity, and workers expected those gains to persist. The family faced a choice: pay more for fewer workers, or accept declining standards. The Earl himself, now in his 50s, began to recognize that something fundamental had shifted. The war had revealed the fragility of systems that had seemed eternal. The financial mathematics of maintaining a house this size had grown more challenging. The social deference that aristocracy had once commanded felt less automatic. Political changes were accelerating. The Labour Party was gaining strength. Socialism was no longer a fringe ideology, but a serious movement. The Russian Revolution, though happening in a different country under different circumstances, sent a chill through England's landed elite. Upheaval was possible, even in England. The 1,920 seconds brought attempts to restore normalcy, or at least the appearance of it. The house reopened for entertaining. Shooting parties resumed. Political guests arrived to discuss post-war policy. The rhythms of country house life reasserted themselves with determined effort, but the effort itself was telling. What had once seemed natural now required conscious maintenance, a performance of aristocratic life rather than its simple continuation. The costs kept rising. Staff wages, maintenance deferred during the war, now demanding attention. Heating bills for a house with 365 rooms in an era when coal prices fluctuated unpredictably. The estate income, while still substantial, no longer covered expenses as comfortably as it once had. Estate managers began discussions about economies, about closing unused wings, about reducing staff, about the long-term sustainability of maintaining a palace that required the income of a small nation to operate properly. The war had cracked something. The house stood, stone and marble intact, but the system that had sustained it was damaged in ways that would take years to fully understand. The 1,920 seconds offered a reprieve, a decade of determined gaiety and willful denial. But the real blow was still ahead. It would come not from battlefield, but from Parliament and the tax collector, and when it came, it would prove more devastating than any artillery barrage. The blow that finally broke the system came not from war, but from Parliament. The 1,930 seconds brought economic depression that reduced estate income even as costs continued to rise. Agricultural rents declined as tenant farmers struggled with crop prices that barely covered expenses. Coal mining royalties, once reliable, fluctuated with industrial demand that never fully recovered from the Great Depression. The 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, who inherited in 1943, faced financial realities his grandfather could not have imagined. The numbers were stark. Maintaining Wentworth Woodhouse in the style it had been built for required an estimated annual expenditure of at least £20,000, possibly more, depending on which repairs could no longer be deferred. The estate's net income, after taxes and operational costs, was shrinking toward that figure. The margin between sustainability and crisis narrowed year by year. Then came the war. Again. September 1939 brought another mobilization, another disruption, another conversion of the house for military purposes. This time, it served as a training facility and officers' quarters rather than a hospital. The requisition meant government rent, a welcome income stream, but it also meant damage, wear, deferred maintenance, and the knowledge that when the military finally left, the house would need expensive repairs the family could not easily afford. The war years saw further staff reductions. Many who might have returned after 1918 were now dead or too old for service. Younger workers found better wages in munitions, factories, and war industries. The servant class that had sustained aristocratic life was shrinking, not through any single decision, but through the gradual erosion of a labor pool that once seemed infinite. By 1945, the household staff numbered perhaps 30, a third of what it had been in 1914, attempting to maintain a house that had been designed to require 3 times that number. The elections of 1945 changed everything. The Labour Party won a landslide victory, the first majority Labour government in British history. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. His government moved immediately to implement a radical program of social reform. The National Health Service, expanded welfare provisions, nationalization of key industries including coal mines, and tax policies explicitly designed to redistribute wealth from the aristocracy to fund the new welfare state. The death duty rate climbed to 80%. 80. When a peer died and the title passed to the heir, the government claimed 4/5 of the estate's value. The calculation was brutal. Assessors valued the land, the house, the art collections, the furnishings, everything. The heir had 6 months to pay. For estates like Wentworth Woodhouse, the bill could run into millions of pounds. Payment required selling land, art, or the house itself, often all 3. The 8th Earl died in 1948. The title passed to his son, the 9th Earl. The death duty assessment arrived like a sentence. The exact figure remains disputed, but credible estimates place it between 2 and 3 million pounds, a sum equivalent to perhaps 80 to 100 million pounds today. The family had 6 months to produce this amount or face forced sales by the government. The mathematics were impossible. The estate's annual income, even in good years, was measured in tens of thousands of pounds, not millions. Borrowing against the property was theoretically possible, but practically suicidal, as the interest payments would consume whatever income remained. The only realistic option was to sell assets, piece by piece, until the debt was satisfied. The art went first. Paintings accumulated over centuries, works by old masters whose value had appreciated beyond anything the original buyers could have imagined, were sent to auction. Christie's and Sotheby's handled the sales. Buyers came from museums and private collectors, many of them American, purchasing pieces of British heritage with dollars that highlighted England's post-war poverty. The family watched their cultural patrimony disperse, knowing each sale was necessary but feeling each loss acutely. Furniture followed. Antique pieces, some commissioned specifically for the house, others inherited from earlier estates, were cataloged and sold. Entire rooms were emptied. What had been collected over 200 years vanished in less than 2. Land sales were more complicated, but equally necessary. Tenant farms that had been part of the estate for generations were sold to sitting tenants or to developers. Acreage that had once stretched across much of South Yorkshire shrank. Each sale reduced future income even as it provided cash to meet the immediate crisis. The family was eating its own assets to survive, and everyone knew the process could not continue indefinitely. The house itself became a burden that overwhelmed every calculation. Maintaining 365 rooms required constant expenditure. Heating costs alone strained budgets. The roof needed repairs that would cost tens of thousands. Windows rotted in frames. Plaster cracked and fell. Water penetration damaged walls and ceilings. Each season of neglect made eventual repairs more expensive, but there was no money for prevention, only crisis management, when failures became catastrophic. Staff reductions continued. By the early 1952, fewer than 20 people worked in the house, and many of those were part-time. Whole wings were closed, furniture covered with dust, sheets, shutters drawn, heating cut off. The family retreated into a smaller and smaller portion of the building, living in perhaps 30 or 40 rooms, leaving the rest to slow decay. The palace that had proclaimed permanence was being mothballed section by section. The family debated options with increasing desperation. Could they keep the house by opening it to paying visitors? The National Trust had pioneered this model at other estates, but it required substantial initial investment to make properties visitor-ready, money the family did not have. Could they sell to a developer? The market for 365-room palaces was non-existent. Developers wanted land, not buildings that would cost more to maintain than any conceivable revenue could support. Demolition was discussed. It had happened elsewhere. Dozens of country houses had been torn down in the post-war years, their stone sold for salvage, their lands cleared for development or returned to agriculture. The National Trust was approached. The Trust's model was clear. They would accept the house if the family provided an endowment large enough to cover maintenance in perpetuity, typically several million pounds. The family did not have several million pounds. They had barely survived the death duty assessment. An endowment was impossible. The trust expressed regret but could not take on a property that would immediately drain resources needed elsewhere. Local authorities were contacted. Could the house serve as a school, a hospital, a government office? The running costs were too high. The building was impractical for modern institutional use. No public body wanted the burden. Private buyers were sought. Advertisements ran in papers. A few inquiries came but collapsed when the true costs became clear. The house was too expensive to run as a residence and too expensive to convert to any profitable purpose. It existed in a limbo where only the wealthiest could afford it, but even the wealthy were not foolish enough to shoulder such costs voluntarily. Meanwhile, physical decay accelerated. A roof section collapsed in 1951, damaging rooms below. Water penetrated through failed lead sheeting, rotting timbers, and destroying plasterwork. Emergency repairs consumed thousands of pounds the family could barely spare. Each crisis revealed new problems. The heating system was failing, pipes corroding, boilers operating beyond their designed lifespan. The electrical system, installed decades earlier, was dangerously outdated. The costs of bringing the house up to modern safety standards would run into hundreds of thousands of pounds, money that simply did not exist. The 9th Earl watched his inheritance crumble. He had done nothing wrong by the standards of his class. He had not gambled away the fortune or made catastrophically bad investments. He had simply inherited a palace at precisely the moment when palaces became impossible to sustain. The social changes that made this outcome inevitable had been building for decades, perhaps centuries, but the collapse came rapidly once the tipping point was reached. By the mid-1950s, the situation was untenable. The family could not keep the house without impoverishing themselves completely. They could not sell it because no buyers existed. They could not give it away because no institution would take it. The house that had been built to last forever, that had consumed the labor of hundreds and the wealth of generations, had become a trap. Permanence had revealed itself as the cruelest illusion of all. In 1946, a potential solution emerged from an unexpected direction. The Lady Mabel College of Physical Education needed new facilities. Negotiations began. The details were complex, the terms carefully structured to provide the family some financial relief while giving the college space for operations. It was not the outcome anyone had imagined when the house was built, but it offered a path forward where none had existed. The decision was made in stages, reluctantly, with full awareness that it marked the end of an era. The house would survive, but not as intended. What the Fitzwilliam family had built to proclaim their eternal position would pass into institutional hands. The palace would become a college, the private fantasy would serve public purpose, and the family would retreat to smaller properties. Their grip on the grand house loosened and then released. The transfer happened in 1946. Lady Mabel College of Physical Education took occupancy of portions of the house under an arrangement that provided the Fitzwilliam family modest rental income and relieved them of maintaining the entire structure. It was not a sale, not a gift, but a hybrid arrangement. Born of desperation on one side and opportunity on the other, the family retained ownership and lived in the West Wing. The college used the East Front and significant portions of the service areas. The palace that had been built to exclude now opened its doors to young women training to become teachers, a purpose unimaginable to those who had laid the foundation stones 2 centuries earlier. The immediate reality shocked both parties. The college had known the house was large, but confronted the true scale only upon moving in. Rooms stretched in sequences that defied practical use. Corridors led to more corridors. The heating system, designed for an era of cheap coal and abundant labor to feed boilers, consumed resources the college budget had not adequately anticipated. Early estimates suggested heating costs alone would be several £1,000s annually, a figure that would strain an educational institution's finances. The physical condition revealed itself slowly and painfully. Inspections uncovered decades of deferred maintenance. Lead roofing had been stripped in places during the war years, stolen for scrap value, leaving sections exposed to weather. Water had penetrated rotting timbers, destroying plaster ceilings, staining walls. Estimates for essential repairs ran to tens of thousands of pounds. The college had funds for education, not for structural restoration of a palace. Compromises were immediate and necessary. Repair what was actively failing. Defer everything else. Close off damaged sections until money materialized to fix them. The adaptation of aristocratic space to institutional purpose created absurd juxtaposes. Ballrooms designed for dancing became gymnasiums. Drawing rooms where political alliances had been negotiated became classrooms. Bedrooms where countesses had slept became dormitories, housing 6 students each. The chandeliers remained, now illuminating physical education students practicing on equipment that would have horrified the original inhabitants. The servant infrastructure proved essential. The industrial kitchens, built to serve elaborate dinners, now fed hundreds of students institutional meals. The laundries, designed for aristocratic linens, handled bedding and towels for a small army of young women. The building's service architecture, the parallel world of back stairs and hidden corridors, made the conversion possible. The house had always required machinery and labor to function. The machinery remained. Only the purposes changed. Staff from the family's era faced difficult transitions. Some retired, their positions eliminated. Others adapted, becoming college employees rather than household servants. A few remained with the family in the West Wing, maintaining continuity in reduced circumstances. The hierarchy that had seemed eternal dissolved. Where once a butler commanded respect through position, now maintenance supervisors managed according to modern employment practices. The old world did not vanish instantly, but it faded. With each retirement, each replacement, each year, that institutional routines overrode aristocratic traditions. The family's experience was more complicated than exile, but less comfortable than remaining in full possession. The 9th Earl and his family occupied perhaps 40 rooms in the West Wing. They had their own entrance, their own reduced staff, their own attempt at maintaining dignity. But the sounds of college life penetrated everywhere. Student voices, athletic activities, institutional bells marking class periods. The house they had known as a private world was now shared, its atmosphere transformed from quiet exclusivity to bustling educational purpose. Public access came gradually and reluctantly. The college recognized that opening portions of the house to tourists could generate income and perhaps raise awareness that might lead to grants or donations. Early tours were limited, guided, carefully controlled. Visitors walked through selected staterooms, still furnished with pieces too large or too damaged to sell. They saw the marble hall, the dining room, the painted ceilings, fragments of grandeur surviving in a building struggling toward new identity. The visitor experience was strange for everyone involved. Tourists who came expecting pristine preservation found decay alongside beauty, plaster falling from walls, empty rooms where furniture had been sold, ropes preventing access to areas deemed unsafe. The contrast between what the house had been and what it had become was inescapable. Some visitors found it melancholy. Others saw it as just punishment for aristocratic excess. Most simply found it impressive in scale and tragic in decline, unsure how to reconcile those simultaneous truths. What remained versus what was lost became painfully clear through the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. The furniture was largely gone, dispersed through auction. The art collection had vanished into museums and private holdings. The silver had been sold. The library's rare books and manuscripts were scattered. What survived was the architecture itself, and a fraction of the furnishings too bulky or too specific to the house to command high prices elsewhere. The building endured as a shell, magnificent but hollowed out, its contents stripped away to pay taxes and fund survival. Restoration was discussed constantly but executed rarely. The costs were simply too high for any single institution to bear. The college maintained what it used, urgently repaired what threatened to collapse, and accepted deterioration in sections they could not afford to address. Heritage organizations and government agencies provided occasional grants, but the amounts were modest compared to needs. A roof section here, a structural support there. Never comprehensive, always triage. The identity crisis persisted through decades. Was Wentworth Woodhouse a historic house? An educational facility? A monument to aristocratic decline? A warning about the costs of grandeur? No single answer satisfied. It was all of these simultaneously. An architectural palimpsest where different eras and purposes overlapped without erasing each other completely. The Fitzwilliam family gradually withdrew further. The 9th Earl died in 1979. The title and remaining estate passed to his heir, but by then the connection to Wentworth Woodhouse was primarily legal rather than lived. The family maintained ownership, but no longer truly inhabited the house in any meaningful sense. They were landlords to an institution, guardians of a building too large to abandon but too expensive to reclaim. Lady Mabel College eventually left in 1988, their lease ending, their needs outgrowing what the building could provide. The house faced another crisis, empty, deteriorating, requiring owners with resources that far exceeded the property's market value. Private buyers attempted ownership. None succeeded in solving the fundamental equation. The house needed millions to maintain. It generated almost nothing in return. Each owner discovered what previous owners had learned. Magnificence was a burden that wealth alone could not sustain. Through the decades of institutional use, something important had been lost, and something else gained. Lost was the fantasy of aristocratic life as the house's natural purpose, the illusion that palaces like this represented some eternal and justified order. Gained was a different kind of evidence. The house survived not as a private possession, but as an institutional space, sustained by collective effort and public interest rather than individual fortune. It suggested, perhaps, that buildings this significant belonged to more than one family, that their preservation required something closer to shared responsibility than private ownership could provide. The transition years were messy, compromised, unsatisfying to everyone involved. The family lost their ancestral seat. The college struggled with a building ill-suited to modern institutional needs. Preservationists watched deterioration they could not prevent. No one got what they wanted. Yet the house survived, which was more than could be said for dozens of comparable country houses that were demolished in the same period. Survival without dignity, perhaps, but survival nonetheless. The question that hung over everything was what came next. The institutional period had been a holding pattern, buying time, but not solving the core problem. When the college left, the house remained. Still vast. Still expensive. Still beautiful. And crumbling in equal measure. Still waiting for someone, anyone, to determine what a monument to permanence should become when permanence itself has proven impossible. The crisis that brought Wentworth Woodhouse back into public attention arrived in 2015. Not a single dramatic event, but the convergence of decades of deferred maintenance, multiple ownership changes, and a preservation community finally recognizing that one of England's largest country houses was approaching the point of no return. The house had survived wars and social upheaval. It might not survive simple neglect. The ownership situation by 2015 was complicated. The Fitzwilliam family had sold the house in 1989 to a private buyer. That owner attempted to develop the property, failed, and sold again. Through the 1992s and 2000s, the house changed hands multiple times, each owner discovering the same impossible mathematics. Annual maintenance costs for a building this size were estimated at between £300,000 and £500,000. Revenue from events, tours, and rentals rarely exceeded £100,000. The deficit was structural, unavoidable, and cumulative. Each year of under-maintenance made future repairs more expensive. The physical deterioration had reached alarming levels. Surveys conducted in 2015 revealed damage that shocked even those familiar with the house. Water penetration through failed roofs had destroyed significant portions of plasterwork, some of it original 18th century craftsmanship. Structural timbers showed rot. Stone facades exhibited cracks where water had frozen and expanded, forcing apart blocks that had stood solid for 250 years. Windows were failing, frames rotted, glass broken or missing, leaving interiors exposed to weather. The heating system was largely non-functional. Electrical wiring dated to the 1922 and posed serious fire hazards. The cost of addressing these problems was staggering. Initial assessments suggested that bringing the house to a safe, weatherproof standard would require at least £40 million. More comprehensive restoration, returning staterooms to something approaching their historical appearance, might cost double that amount. £80 million, £100 million. The figures varied depending on ambition and methodology, but all agreed the scale was far beyond anything a private owner could reasonably shoulder. The question became political almost immediately. Should public money fund the restoration of an aristocratic palace? Britain in 2015 was still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. The Conservative government was implementing austerity policies, cutting social services, reducing welfare provisions, closing libraries and community centers. Against that backdrop, the idea of spending tens of millions on a country house triggered immediate debate. Preservationists argued that Wentworth Woodhouse represented significant cultural heritage. The architecture was exceptional, among the finest examples of Palladian design in England. The history was important, touching on centuries of political, social, and economic development. The building was evidence, a physical record that deserved preservation regardless of its aristocratic origins. Lost monuments could never be recovered. Better to save what remained while options still existed. Critics countered with fury. Why preserve monuments to inequality? The house had been built on wealth extracted from coal miners and tenant farmers. It represented a class system that had oppressed millions. Public funds should address housing shortages, fund the NHS, support schools. Spending millions on a palace was an obscene misuse of resources when working families struggled to afford basic necessities. Let the house fall. Let it become a ruin. That outcome would teach its own valuable lesson about the transience of power built on exploitation. The debate played out in newspapers, on social media, in Parliament. Heritage organizations lobbied for funding. Local communities divided. Some saw preservation as economic opportunity, the house as potential tourist attraction that could bring jobs and revenue to a region that had struggled economically since the coal mines closed. Others saw it as a distraction from more pressing needs, a sentimental attachment to a past better left behind. In 2016, the house was sold again, this time to the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust, a charitable organization specifically created to save the building. The purchase price was reportedly £7 million, a fraction of what restoration would require, but a significant sum for a charity to raise. The trust's model was clear. They would seek grants from government heritage agencies, from lottery funds, from private donors, and from European Union structural funds. They would open the house more widely to tourists, generating operational income. They would create a sustainable model where preservation supported itself through public engagement rather than private wealth. The initial grants came through. Heritage England provided funding for emergency roof repairs. The European Regional Development Fund contributed toward stabilization work. Private donations arrived from individuals who valued preservation or had family connections to the area. By 2017, active restoration was underway. Contractors arrived. Scaffolding rose around sections of the facade. The work was careful, methodical, and expensive. Every element had to meet conservation standards. Craftsmen skilled in traditional techniques were scarce and commanded high wages. Materials had to match original specifications where possible. Stone came from the same quarries that had supplied the house centuries earlier. Lead for roofing was sourced and installed using methods that had changed little since the 18th century. The progress was visible, but achingly slow. A roof section repaired. A set of windows restored. One stateroom made safe and weatherproof. Each achievement represented thousands of hours of labor and hundreds of thousands of pounds. Yet the scale of remaining work dwarfed what had been accomplished. Heritage England estimated that comprehensive restoration would take at least a decade, possibly two, assuming funding continued at current levels. There was no guarantee it would. Brexit complicated everything. In 2016, Britain voted to leave the European Union. EU structural funds, which had been supporting heritage projects across the UK, would eventually end. The exact timeline and replacement funding remained uncertain, but preservation trusts faced the real possibility of significant budget shortfalls just as major projects were underway. Wentworth Woodhouse's restoration relied heavily on EU funds. Their loss would force difficult decisions about which parts of the house to save and which to abandon. The house functioned now in a strange hybrid state. Parts were open to tourists, guided tours running through staterooms that had been stabilized and made safe. Visitors walked through the marble hall, stood in the dining room, climbed the central staircase, experienced the scale firsthand. The tours generated modest income, perhaps £200,000 annually by 2018. Helpful, but insufficient to cover operating costs, plus the ongoing restoration expenses. Other parts of the house remained closed, too dangerous for public access. Ceilings that could collapse, floors weakened by rot, rooms filled with debris from failed plaster. These spaces existed behind barriers and warning signs, reminders that preservation was incomplete and precarious. Tour guides explained carefully. The house was being saved, but slowly. Some rooms might not be accessible for years or decades. Some might never be fully restored if funding fell short. The staff who worked at Wentworth Woodhouse in the 2010 seconds and 2020 seconds occupied roles unimaginable to the original servants. Conservators assessed damage and planned restoration strategies. Project managers coordinated contractors and tracked budgets. Tour guides educated visitors about architecture and history. Event coordinators arranged weddings and corporate functions in spaces that could support them. Fundraisers cultivated donors and wrote grant applications. The work was professional, specialized, and driven by preservation rather than personal service to aristocratic owners. Yet echoes of the original hierarchy persisted. The house still required constant physical labor. Cleaners maintained the spaces open to tourists. Groundskeepers tended the parkland and gardens. Maintenance workers handled minor repairs and monitored systems. These roles were paid better than their predecessors' positions and operated under modern employment law. But the basic pattern remained. Some people's labor kept the building functional, while others planned, managed, and directed. The climate crisis added urgency to preservation debates. Weather patterns were shifting. Storms were growing more severe. Flooding risks were increasing across Yorkshire. Wentworth Woodhouse sat on low-lying ground near rivers that had flooded multiple times in recent decades. A major flood could devastate the house, destroying in hours what centuries had preserved. Climate modeling suggested that, without significant intervention, the house faced mounting risks that would only accelerate through the 21st century. Preservation was no longer simply fixing what had decayed. It required anticipating and defending against threats that previous generations never faced. The maintenance backlog was crushing. Beyond the highly visible staterooms, hundreds of other spaces needed attention. Service wings, staff quarters, storage areas, basements. Each had its own decay, its own structural issues, its own claim on limited resources. The trust made difficult choices daily. Which roof section was most urgent? Which plasterwork could wait another year? Which room could be safely closed for another decade? The decisions were strategic, guided by expertise, but always constrained by money that ran out long before needs were met. Recent setbacks tested resolve. In 2018, Water penetration in one wing caused a ceiling collapse, damaging historic plasterwork and destroying months of careful stabilization work. The loss was painful, both for the craftsmanship destroyed and for the resources wasted on repairs that failed to prevent the collapse. The incident highlighted how fragile the house remained despite ongoing work. One storm, one unexpected failure, one delayed repair could undo years of effort. Fundraising remained constant and challenging. The Trust organized events, launched campaigns, pursued every available grant program. Major donors were cultivated carefully. Heritage Lottery funding applications consumed hundreds of hours of staff time. The Trust competed with thousands of other organizations seeking the same limited pools of money. Success was never guaranteed. Each year brought anxiety about whether next year's funding would materialize. Political debates intensified as costs mounted. Each new grant application triggered fresh arguments. Conservative politicians questioned whether heritage funding represented good value for taxpayers. Labor politicians asked whether aristocratic houses deserved priority over social housing or health care. Liberal Democrats and Greens supported preservation but wanted clear public benefit demonstrated through education programs and community access. The debates were rarely conclusive. Funding came through or it didn't, decisions driven by bureaucratic criteria as much as political conviction. The controversies about whose heritage was being preserved sharpened. Researchers investigating the Fitzwilliam wealth uncovered connections to colonial enterprise and to industries built on exploited labor. The coal wealth that funded the house's construction came from miners who worked in conditions that killed and disabled thousands. The broader Fitzwilliam business interests extended to plantations and trade networks that included slavery, though the direct connections were complicated and disputed. These revelations complicated the preservation narrative. The house was not simply beautiful architecture. It was evidence of systems that enriched a few through the suffering of many. The Trust responded by expanding educational programming to address these histories directly. Tours now included information about the workers who built the house, the miners whose labor funded it, the class systems it embodied. This approach satisfied some critics and angered others. Activists wanted more explicit condemnation of aristocratic wealth. Conservatives argued the Trust was imposing contemporary political views on historical contexts. The Trust tried to navigate between extremes, presenting facts while avoiding both celebration and unthinking condemnation. Modern interventions created their own tensions. The house needed to generate income. That required facilities visitors expected. Cafes were installed. Gift shops opened. Event spaces were marketed for weddings and corporate functions. Disabled access was added where possible. Ramps and lifts introduced in ways that minimized damage to historic fabric. These changes were necessary for sustainable operation but altered the building's character. Purists objected to commercial intrusions. Pragmatists argued survival required compromise. Both were right, and the tension remained unresolved. The Wentworth Woodhouse story by 2020 was one of precarious survival. The house still stood. Restoration was happening. Public access was increasing. Educational programs were reaching thousands. Yet the future remained uncertain. Funding could dry up. Political priorities could shift. Climate threats could overwhelm defensive measures. The house existed day to day, project to project, grant to grant, never more than a few years away from crisis. The pandemic in 2020 struck hard. Tourism collapsed. Income vanished. Events were canceled. Staff were furloughed. The restoration slowed as contractors faced their own crises. Yet the house remained empty and quiet, as it had been through previous upheavals. When restrictions eased, visitors returned. The work resumed. The pattern held. Crisis, survival, recovery, another crisis ahead. Those working at Wentworth Woodhouse in the 2022 understood they were living inside a question that would outlast them. Could a building this large, this expensive, this historically complicated, be sustained through shared public effort rather than private wealth? The answer was still being determined, day by day, repair by repair, grant application by grant application, in a slow-motion experiment whose outcome would reveal much about what England valued and what it chose to preserve when forced to decide what mattered most. The lessons were there. Whether anyone chose to see them was another question entirely. Wentworth Woodhouse's story reflected England's contradictions with uncomfortable clarity. The house was a mirror, and what it showed depended entirely on who was looking and what they were willing to admit. For some, the narrative illustrated triumph. A determined aristocrat built something extraordinary. Architects and craftsmen created beauty that survived centuries. A preservation trust rescued the house from ruin. In this version, the story was about human creativity, about the value of preserving remarkable achievements regardless of their origins, about buildings that transcended the circumstances of their creation to become heritage belonging to everyone. For others, the same sequence of events told a much darker tale. Wealth extracted from miners and tenant farmers built a monument to one family's ego. Generations of servants labored invisibly to maintain a fantasy of aristocratic superiority. The house embodied a class system that denied dignity and opportunity to millions. Public funds now preserved this monument, while working families struggled with inadequate housing and declining services. In that telling, the story was about exploitation, sanctified as culture, about how power wrote its own history and called it heritage. Both narratives contained truth. Both left out crucial pieces. The real story of Wentworth Woodhouse was messier and more layered than either political position acknowledged. It was a story about labor. Generations of workers whose skill and effort built and maintained a place they could never afford to inhabit as anything other than servants. The men who cut stone in quarries, who died falling from scaffolding, who spent lifetimes in service without seeing their names recorded anywhere except payroll ledgers that no one kept. Their labor was as essential to the house's existence as any architect's vision. Yet history had erased them almost completely. It was a story about ambition and the strange ways insecurity drove creation. Thomas Watson Wentworth built Wentworth Woodhouse not from confidence, but from anxiety, desperate to prove his family's permanence through stone and scale. The impulse was human, understandable even. Yet the execution revealed how unchecked wealth could transform insecurity into monuments that demanded other people's suffering to sustain. The house was both impressive achievement and evidence of a system that valued aristocratic comfort over basic human dignity for the many who made that comfort possible. It was also a story about class in England, about divisions that barely shifted no matter which names appeared on the deed or which party held parliament. The workers who set tile in the 1,730 seconds and the staff who guide tours in the 2,020 seconds occupy different rungs on the same fundamental ladder. Both provide labor that makes the house function. Both receive wages that place them in economic categories far below the wealth the house represents. The distance between those who serve and those who are served, or between those who labor and those who decide, has narrowed in some ways and persisted in others. Legal protections improved. Wages rose in relative terms, yet the basic dynamic remained recognizable across 3 centuries. The house revealed how England mythologized wealth and aristocracy. For generations, the system presented itself as natural, inevitable, divinely ordained even. Aristocrats ruled because they were naturally suited to rule. The poor served because that was their proper place. The house itself was evidence of this order, proof that some families simply belonged at the top. The illusion was powerful enough that it survived long after the material basis collapsed. Even now, preservation debates often treat aristocratic houses with reverence that quietly accepts their original purpose as legitimate, rather than examining what that purpose actually required. Wentworth Woodhouse's story also exposed how public and private interests intertwined in ways that defied simple categories. The family built the house with private wealth, but that wealth came from coal extracted by workers, from rents paid by tenant farmers, from an economic system structured by law and custom to channel resources upward. When the house became unsustainable, it was public funds that eventually enabled its preservation. The building had always existed in a web of social relationships and power structures, never purely private, no matter what property law claimed. The comparison with other great houses sharpened certain patterns. Chatsworth survived through similar transformations, family wealth replaced by institutional management and tourist revenue. Castle Howard remained with the Howard family, but only by opening extensively to visitors and generating commercial income. Blenheim Palace endured through a combination of ducal ownership and aggressive commercialization. The National Trust managed dozens of properties using the model Wentworth Woodhouse's trust now attempted. The pattern was consistent. Private wealth alone could no longer sustain these houses. Survival required some form of collective support, whether through charitable trusts, government grants, or revenue from millions of visitors paying to see spaces that had once been closed to all but a select few. Yet each survival represented compromises that satisfied no one completely. Preservationists mourned the loss of authentic private context, the sense that these had been living homes rather than museums. The public resented being asked to fund preservation of monuments to class privilege. The buildings themselves existed in a strange state, neither fully private nor fully public, maintained through hybrid models that could collapse if any component failed. The empire's shadow lay across everything. The Fitzwilliam wealth had roots not only in Yorkshire coal, but in broader networks of trade and investment that extended to colonies and to industries built on exploited labor far beyond England. The connections were complicated, indirect in many cases, but undeniable. The house stood on foundations that included suffering, dispossession, and death, occurring at distances that made them easy to ignore. Reckoning with that history was essential to understanding what the house actually represented, what system had made it possible, what costs others had paid for one family's grandeur. The death duties that finally broke aristocratic control represented a form of social revolution, gradual rather than violent, but revolutionary nonetheless. The transfer of wealth from private aristocratic hands to collective public purposes through taxation fundamentally restructured English society. The process was neither complete nor entirely just. Some aristocrats found ways to protect fortunes through trusts and legal maneuvers. Some wealth shifted into new forms rather than genuinely redistributing. Yet the basic pattern was real. Aristocratic power that had seemed permanent was dismantled through policy choices made by elected governments. The great houses stood as evidence of that transformation, monuments to a system that no longer functioned. The National Trust and similar organizations served ambiguous purposes. They preserved buildings of genuine historical and architectural significance. They made heritage accessible to millions who would never have seen these spaces under aristocratic control. They provided education and research opportunities. Yet they also sanitized history, presenting houses primarily as aesthetic and cultural treasures while downplaying the exploitation that funded them. Tour narratives often focused on architecture, furnishings, and family stories, while mentioning servants only in passing, if at all. The labor that made these buildings possible remained largely invisible even in the stories told about them. The preservation debates revealed deep uncertainties about whose heritage mattered and what preservation meant. England was more diverse in the 2020 seconds than when Wentworth Woodhouse was built. Whose history did these aristocratic houses represent? For descendants of coal miners, the house might symbolize oppression rather than heritage. For immigrant communities, these monuments to British aristocracy might feel alien, symbols of a society that had long excluded them. Yet the buildings themselves were historical evidence, witnesses to how England developed, what systems shaped it, who benefited, and who paid the price. Preserving them while telling honest stories about what they represented was valuable. Preserving them while maintaining aristocratic mythology was not. The climate crisis added urgency that dwarfed human disputes. Weather patterns were destabilizing. Flooding risks were mounting. Storms were intensifying. Buildings like Wentworth Woodhouse, constructed in an era when climate seemed stable and predictable, faced threats their builders never imagined. The house might survive centuries of social change only to succumb to physical forces that contemporary society struggled to address. Stone and marble were durable, but not invincible. Water and wind would eventually win unless enormous resources were continuously devoted to defense. The question was whether future generations would consider that worth doing. What England chose to remember versus what it chose to forget became clear in physical form at places like Wentworth Woodhouse. The families' names were recorded, their portraits painted, their achievements celebrated. The workers' names vanished. No portraits commemorated the men who died building the house. No plaques honored the servants who maintained it for generations. The selective memory was built into the structure itself, into tour narratives, into what was preserved and what was allowed to disappear. Honest history required recovering what had been erased, naming the labor, acknowledging the costs, refusing to let beauty obscure exploitation. The complexity was real and could not be wished away. The house had genuine architectural and historical value. It was also evidence of profound injustice. Both things were true simultaneously. The choice was not between preserving everything uncritically or destroying everything in symbolic rejection. The choice was about what stories to tell, what context to provide, whose perspectives to center. A building could be preserved while its history was honestly examined. Beauty could be acknowledged while costs were named. The contemporary relevance was inescapable. Wealth inequality in 2020 seconds, Britain approached levels not seen since the era when Wentworth Woodhouse was built. New fortunes accumulated in different industries, technology and finance rather than coal and land, but the basic pattern of extreme concentration was familiar. The wealthy still purchased property that ordinary people could never afford. They still benefited from labor that was systematically undercompensated. They still used political influence to protect their advantages. The mechanisms differed, but the dynamics persisted. Wentworth Woodhouse's story offered context for understanding contemporary wealth, revealing patterns that repeated across centuries unless actively disrupted. The question of responsibility was both collective and individual. Collectively, England had to decide what heritage merited preservation and what honest preservation required. That meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the past, rather than indulging in nostalgia. It meant ensuring preservation benefited broad public interest, rather than serving primarily to gratify the affluent. It meant examining contemporary wealth accumulation with the same skeptical eye applied to historical aristocracy. Individually, everyone who encountered stories like Wentworth Woodhouse's faced a choice. Accept simplified narratives that fit existing political commitments, or engage with complexity even when uncomfortable. Assume the past was radically different from the present, or recognize patterns that persisted despite surface changes. Treat these places as mere architectural curiosities, or see them as evidence demanding examination. The physical reality returned inevitably. Beyond debates and preservation plans, the house existed as stone, timber, lead, and glass. These materials obeyed physical laws indifferent to human intentions. Water penetrated through failed seals. Frost expanded in cracks, forcing stone apart. Wood rotted when exposed to moisture. Metal corroded. Every day without maintenance was a day of small failures that accumulated toward major collapse. The house survived only through constant human effort, work that had never stopped since construction began 3 centuries earlier. Different hands performed the labor now, for different purposes, but the basic requirement remained unchanged. Buildings demanded care, or they failed. The workers who maintained Wentworth Woodhouse in the 2020 seconds understood something visitors often missed. The house was not primarily a museum or a symbol. It was a job site, a place where real people performed real labor for real wages that were modest by any standard. They repaired roofs in Yorkshire weather. They scraped away rot and installed new timber. They cleaned toilets after tour groups. They mowed lawns and trimmed hedges. Their work was essential, skilled, and systematically undervalued, just as the work of their predecessors had been. The building's survival depended on them. The narratives told about the house rarely centered them. The future remained genuinely uncertain. The Preservation Trust's model might succeed, creating a sustainable approach that balanced heritage conservation with public access and honest education. Or funding might dry up. Political priorities might shift. Climate disasters might overwhelm defensive measures. The house might become a romantic ruin, picturesque in decay, teaching different lessons than preservation could. Either outcome was possible. The present moment existed in between, suspended in a battle whose result was not predetermined. What seemed clear was that no single entity could bear this burden alone. Not a private owner, however wealthy. Not a charity, however dedicated. Not government, however well-funded. Sustaining buildings on this scale required distributed effort, multiple funding sources, broad public support, and political will that could survive electoral cycles. The model was still being invented, tested, refined. Success was not guaranteed. The house stood on its Yorkshire ground, magnificent and vulnerable, holding nearly 3 centuries of accumulated meanings. The facade stretched 600 feet, visible for miles across the landscape just as its builders intended. Inside, some rooms gleamed with careful restoration, while others remained closed, their ceilings fallen, their futures unknown. Contractors worked on scaffolding, fitting new lead to ancient roof structures. Tour guides led visitors through marble halls, their narratives attempting to balance celebration with honesty. Curators planned exhibitions examining the coal industry that funded construction. Fundraisers wrote grant applications, pursuing money that was never sufficient. The work continued. Morning after morning, staff arrived. Maintenance tasks were performed. Tours were given. Repairs were made. The cycle repeated. Has repeated. Would repeat as long as anyone chose to sustain it. The question was not whether the house could survive indefinitely. Nothing survived indefinitely. Stone crumbled. Climate changed. Societies transformed. Eventually, centuries from now, or perhaps sooner, Wentworth Woodhouse would fall. The question was, what happened between now and then? Whether the effort to preserve it was worth the cost, and what that cost should include. Whether the stories told would be honest or sanitized. Whether the workers who maintained it received dignity along with wages. Whether the house would teach lessons about class and power or simply perpetuate myths about heritage. Whether England would face its history clearly or look away from what was uncomfortable. Those were human choices, not architectural ones. The building could not make them. It could only stand, bearing witness, offering evidence, waiting for decisions that each generation would make or postpone. The stone would outlast current debates. It would outlast current workers and preservationists and critics. It would stand until it didn't. Testament to both human achievement and human exploitation. Beautiful and troubling. Preserved or lost according to choices made by people who would themselves be forgotten long before the facade finally fell. The responsibility sat with those still breathing, still deciding, still holding the power to act or abstain. The house was there. Its history was there. The patterns it revealed were there. What anyone did with that knowledge, whether it changed anything or simply added another layer of meaning to a building that already carried too many, remained to be determined.